Without proper air cover, with inadequate weaponry, poor lines of communication, and a muddled command structure.
This sort of operation had not been in...
Can't go out like that, you'll get soaked.
I don't think so, Gordon. Rain seems to have stopped.
And look, there's a rainbow.
Come on, Carol, you can't stand there all night.
Just a few more minutes, Mr. Brittas, just in case it's been delayed.
He hasn't been delayed, Carol. He's not coming, is he?
But you did say on the phone, Mr. Brittas.
Face it, Carol, if he wanted to be here, he'd be here. Obviously, this wasn't as important to him as it is to you.
Yes, I know, I'm sure you're right. It's just I sort of hoped.
There are some things in life you just can't have. You've got to make the best of what you've got.
Colin and Pauline are giving us a lift on the milk float. They're just clearing the empties off the back. That's you, Carol. Yes, I suppose I am, Mr. Brittas.
Oh, look! It's going to rain again!
Come on, let's party!
Brittas is back in a fortnight's time, but Chris Barry's back on BBC1 sooner than that, live and kicking on Saturday morning at 9.
Brand new comedy on BBC1 with John Gordon Sinclair and Sophie Thompson, ace reporters on The Herald.
Maybe I just don't have your luck at the moment. Only 2 weeks ago you were on the spot when that block of flats burnt down.
I lived there.
But you still got a good story out of it, didn't you?
I lost my home in that fire.
But it's not all smooth running.
How did it go?
Well, yeah, great, no trouble at all.
Nelson's Common, beginning Thursday at 8 on BBC1.
Asthma affects 3 million people. Many are children. It's uncomfortable and upsetting, and it can be fatal. New evidence shows that there's a direct link between asthma and air pollution, and one type of air pollution in particular, car exhaust fumes. Yet we feed our lungs with those fumes daily. Car fumes and asthma. Panorama reports tonight, 9:30 BBC1.
Horizon on BBC2 now provides a picture of the inquiry into an air crash in the Panamanian jungle 2 years ago. And on BBC1, the 9 o'clock news with Peter Sissons.
The Western Allies issue a tough new warning to the Bosnian Serbs about ignoring the airstrike deadline. General Rose says that if all heavy weapons aren't under UN control by Sunday midnight, they will be bombed. John Major makes it clear again there'll be no retreat from back to basics. And 5 years after condemning Salman Rushdie to death, Iran says the sentence must be carried out. Good evening. The Western Alliance tonight issued a barrage of stern warnings to the Bosnian Serbs about the consequences of ignoring the deadline to lift the siege of Sarajevo. After a day of conflicting signals about the possible flexibility of the ultimatum, and with only a trickle of heavy weapons surrendered, statements at the United Nations and in Sarajevo itself put the pressure back on. The UN commander for Bosnia, General Rose, pledged that the total exclusion zone for heavy weapons, Serb or Muslim, would be implemented. In New York, America's ambassador to the United Nations said the Bosnian Serbs faced bitter consequences if they did not comply. The Serbs, who still hold scores of heavy guns in the hills around Sarajevo, are so far thought to have removed about 28 heavy weapons back to barracks at Lukavica, behind Sarajevo Airport, and near Pale, their military headquarters. Both are well within the 12-mile exclusion zone, although Pale is exempt under NATO rules.
The Serb forces around Sarajevo held their ground today, hoping to exploit confusion among their opponents. A dozen or so guns were pulled back from the hills, a few tanks disappeared from the back streets, but mostly they waited to see if the UN would soften the terms of NATO's ultimatum. Instead, tonight, General Rose said he wanted NATO's conditions to be met to the letter.
The total exclusion zone for heavy weapons around a 20-kilometre radius of Sarajevo will be implemented, and any heavy weapons there will be either under UNPROFOR control or will be subject to air attack.
That brings the UN firmly back in line with last week's NATO Council decision. NATO officials had been worrying that the UN would settle for observing Serb weapons instead of controlling them. In return, they confirmed that the decision to launch airstrikes was one reserved for the United Nations. Tonight, the Security Council in New York began an extended debate with a closing of ranks. Russia muted its opposition to airstrikes. Others insisted there was ample authority to order them.
The international community is saying to the Bosnian Serbs, you have a choice. You can live up to your avowed desire for peace by cooperating in steps that will reduce tensions and improve the climate for peace, or you can take aggressive actions and invite the bitter consequences. In making this choice, you should not doubt our will or that of our NATO partners.
Diplomatic words are being matched by military actions. HMS Ark Royal, on station in the Adriatic, is flying reconnaissance missions over Sarajevo. The film from the Sea Harriers is being used to pinpoint the guns that may be targets as early as next Monday. They have to be ready for anything.
There's always a surprise around the corner. We think that we're reaching a deadline or a watershed, and something happens to change it. However, I'd have to say that today's or the recent events make me think that we're closer to action now than we ever have been.
The planes are armed and ready. Although the ultimatum has a week to run, NATO forces are already authorised to punish breaches of the ceasefire. And whatever earlier reservations Britain may have had, once an ultimatum is delivered, the only credible policy is to stand by it. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News.
The Bosnian Serb leader, Radovan Karadzic, today repeated his refusal to recognise the NATO ultimatum, saying he would deal only with the United Nations. He's been attending a meeting of the Bosnian Serb leadership in Pale, outside Sarajevo. Serbs there have been holding their own Winter Olympic Games after being refused entry to the real event.
The Serbian Winter Olympics opened at Pale, the Bosnian Serb headquarters, outside Sarajevo today. A small gesture of defiance to a world community which refuses to accept them and which is now threatening to attack them. It was a pretty much do-it-yourself affair, and not even the Russians or Greeks, their only real friends, turned up. But it was intended partly to show that the Serbs can't be pushed around. Still, Dr. Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serbs' leader, is cooperating at present over the peace agreement for Sarajevo. Though he maintained it had nothing to do with the NATO ultimatum, it was because of his agreement with the UN.
We do not deal with the NATO ultimatum. We are dealing with the United Nations. We have already agreed our weaponry to be controlled by United Nations.
That's a dubious distinction, but he's unwilling to admit that he's giving in to an ultimatum. A mile or so away, Major Radomir Kojic of the Bosnian Serb army is going the rounds of the sector of the front he commands. He's a quiet, thoughtful man who makes a point of helping the French UN soldiers who've been sent up here to oversee the removal of his guns. Today, the Major has brought them a bottle of Slivovitz, the ferocious local home brew. Thanks to him, the Frenchmen now live under cover. This former hotel may be wrecked, but it's better than living out in the open as they were doing before. Still, in spite of Major Kojic's friendliness, the lives of these Frenchmen would, he says, be in serious danger if NATO were to carry out airstrikes in a week's time.
If anyone bombs my child, there'll be nothing more to discuss. They'll all be treated the same. If they want to bomb us, they'll have to bomb the civilians as well, because they live so close by. There'll be no need then for the West to come to Sarajevo, because there'll be nothing left of Sarajevo.
Would you consider the possibility of attacking the NATO troops that we've been seeing here, the French troops?
Yes, for sure. Everybody. The UN, NATO, UNHCR, journalists, everybody.
Major Koich's men don't look particularly impressive compared with the French troops who are stationed alongside them. But there are only 17 Frenchmen here, and they'd have a tough fight on their hands if they were attacked. The Bosnian Serbs are basically partisans, irregulars. If it comes to it, they're unlikely to fight according to the rulebook. John Simpson, BBC News, Pale.
And you can see John Simpson's full report from Pale in Newsnight on BBC 2 at 10:30. Bosnia is likely to be the dominant subject of talks between John Major and the Russian government tomorrow. Mr. Major arrived in Moscow this evening for a 3-day visit. Downing Street officials said the Prime Minister was anxious to stress there was no need for a rift between East and West over Bosnia.
John Major arrived dressed for the bitter cold of the Moscow night with two clear diplomatic goals in mind: to assess for himself the prospects for economic reform and to deal with Russian fears about the wisdom and the practicality of airstrikes in Bosnia. Russia also has peacekeeping troops in what was Yugoslavia, but Mr. Major will be telling his counterpart Viktor Chernomyrdin that the countries of NATO do not accept that Moscow has a veto on their attempt to find a settlement. Vladimir Zhirinovsky, extreme nationalist and backer of the Bosnian Serbs, is one Russian politician Mr. Major won't be meeting. Although he boasts his party is winning everything in Russian politics these days, even this parliamentary ski race. But Mr. Yeltsin's supporters say the president is still very much the man in charge.
He is in control, and he guarantees that there will be no reversal, both in internal or foreign policy, whatever Mr. Zhirinovsky or Zhirinovsky mania in media, be it Russian or Western, says.
But Boris Yeltsin is a suffering and lonely man, in the words of one radical minister who left the government after the reformers' disastrous performance in parliamentary elections 2 months ago. The new government very much reflects the views of Mr. Chernomyrdin, Prime Minister whose critics call him the Red Manager, because they say he wants to restore a measure of central planning and is prepared to prop up Soviet industry, even if that means allowing inflation to rise. When John Major comes to the Kremlin, he'll hear assurances that the course of political and economic reform is running smoothly. Behind those public pledges, he'll have to judge for himself to what extent Russia's commitment to painful change is being quietly abandoned. Kevin Connolly, BBC News, Moscow.
Here, before he left, the Prime Minister strongly rejected calls from some Conservatives to abandon his Back to Basics campaign. Downing Street said the policies for education, law and order and the economy met the needs of ordinary people, and the campaign was here to stay.
Party managers like Chief Whip Richard Ryder trudged into a chilly Downing Street this morning with damage limitation from a weekend resignation once again on the agenda. But despite the tendency of the Back to Basics